Welcome to Life Stories, where we share inspiring and emotional journeys of love, loss, and second chances. Today's story takes us on a transformative journey aboard a luxury cruise, where a mother and her twin boys come face to face with a past they thought they had left behind. As old wounds are reopened and secrets are revealed, they must navigate the complexities of forgiveness, healing, and rebuilding trust. Join us as we dive into a tale of rediscovery, family, and the hope for a fresh start. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story. Emily stood at the bustling cruise terminal, the hum of voices and the clatter of luggage swirling around her. She gripped the tickets tightly in her hand, feeling the paper crinkle between her fingers as if it might slip away from her grasp at any moment. Her heart was racing, a nervous flutter rising in her chest, though she did her best to hide it from her twin boys, Jack and Lucas. She smiled at them, encouraging their wide-eyed excitement as they tugged her along through the crowd. She had worked tirelessly for the past year, scraping together every penny she could to make this trip happen. It wasn't much, a simple cruise for a few days, but it was her promise to them. A chance to make memories they would cherish. She wanted to fill their lives with joy, to give them a piece of happiness that might compensate for the absence of their father, a presence that had been a shadow in their lives since the beginning. Emily often found herself swallowing the painful questions Jack and Lucas would ask about their father. Questions she could never fully answer. She glanced down at her phone one last time, checking her account balance. Her stomach twisted as she saw the numbers, close to nothing left. But when she saw Jack's eager grin as he pointed excitedly at the massive cruise ship waiting in the harbor, her anxiety melted away, if only for a moment. This was it. She had done it. They were here. I can't believe we're really going, Mom, Lucas said, his voice brimming with the innocent joy only children could muster. Emily smiled, but deep down, the tight knot in her stomach remained. She had stretched every dollar for this moment. The boys didn't know how tight things had been. They didn't know that every day was a battle to keep their small family afloat. But now, standing at the edge of this grand ship, their excitement made it all feel worth it. She could ignore her fears just a little longer. For their sake, the boys danced around her, barely able to contain their excitement as the ship loomed larger, a floating palace on the water. Emily, however, couldn't shake the weight of the sacrifices it had taken to get here. The last year had been an exhausting grind of long hours and frugal living. But she held her breath and carried on with a quiet strength, always masking her weariness behind a facade of confidence for her sons. As they reached the registration counter, Emily caught sight of a tall figure stepping out of a sleek black sedan. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the bright lights. Matthew Bennett, the name that had once meant everything to her, now distant, detached, and buried under the weight of time and silence. She couldn't help but notice him. Even in the bustle of the terminal, he moved with purpose, ignoring the curious stares from onlookers as he strode forward, his assistant trailing behind, murmuring about schedules and meetings. His demeanor, unwavering, confident, was a far cry from the man she had once known. In another life, he had been her partner. But that life had ended the moment he walked away, leaving her behind to pick up the pieces. Emily didn't have time to dwell on it. The boys, full of energy and excitement, tugged her away toward the boarding area, oblivious to the storm that had just passed by them. They didn't notice how her smile faltered for just a second, how her chest tightened when she caught sight of the man she had once loved. She shoved the memories back down, forcing herself to focus on the moment at hand. They finally boarded the ship, and Emily was amazed by the grandeur of it all. The gleaming floors, the towering ceilings, the vibrant decor, everything looked so polished, so perfect. It was a far cry from the small, modest life she had been leading on land. She guided the boys through the reception area, their eyes wide with wonder as they pointed at the grand chandeliers and oversized windows. Her heart swelled with pride. They deserved this. They deserved every moment of joy, every ounce of excitement they could find on this trip. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to forget the weight of her past, to let go of the struggle. As they navigated their way to their cabin, Emily's thoughts wandered. She found herself remembering a time when things had been different. A time when she had believed Matthew was her future. How had they gotten here? How had the dreams they shared, the plans they made, faded into the past? She tried not to think about it. There was no point. It had been years, and the man who once promised he would never leave was long gone. But she couldn't entirely silence the thoughts. On nights when the silence in their small apartment grew unbearable, when the weight of raising the twins on her own seemed overwhelming, she sometimes let herself think back to those days. The warmth of Matthew's touch. The way he'd whispered promises of a future together. She quickly shoved the thoughts away. This trip wasn't for her to dwell on the past. It was for Jack and Lucas. As they settled into their small cabin on the lower deck, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. It had been a long day. And as the boys bounced from bed to bed, laughing and shrieking with excitement, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could have something like this every year. She watched them with a tender smile as they unpacked, their chatter filling the room with warmth. She could feel their innocence, their joy, and it made the sacrifices feel worth it. But even as she smiled, there was a gnawing sense of unease in the pit of her stomach. It was the same feeling she had carried for years now. The feeling of being alone. Of doing it all on her own. And yet, she didn't mind. Not really. She had learned to be strong. To be both mother and father to her children. But there were moments, just fleeting moments, when the weight of it all would threaten to overwhelm her. Still, as the night crept in and the soft lull of the ship rocked them to sleep, Emily chose to focus on the joy of the moment. Jack and Lucas were happy. They were safe. And for now, that was all that mattered. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Emily's cabin, casting soft light across the room. The gentle hum of the ship's engines added to the serene atmosphere. The kind of calm Emily had longed for. She stood by the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of blue water. The weight of the past few years, years of struggle, heartbreak, and resilience, seemed to melt away in the quiet moment. Her twins, Jack and Lucas, were still asleep, sprawled out on their beds, their faces soft with the innocence of childhood. But the peace she so desperately needed didn't last long. As the ship rocked gently, memories she had tried so hard to bury crept back into her mind. She closed her eyes, fighting to push them away. There was no need to remember. Not now. Not when everything felt so new. So fresh. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on the door. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her first thought being that it was her children, already up and full of energy. But then she realized it was too early for them. She opened the door cautiously, her nerves already on edge for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Standing there was a young staff member, smiling brightly. "Good morning, ma'am. Just a reminder that breakfast will be served in about an hour. If you'd like, we can send someone to assist you with any last-minute requests." Emily smiled faintly, nodding her thanks. "That will be fine. We'll be down in a little while." As the door closed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her mind wandered back to the strange dream-like feeling she'd had when she first glimpsed Matthew the day before. Had it really been him? Could he possibly be here? On the same cruise? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It had to be her imagination playing tricks. After all, it had been years since she'd seen him, years since he'd disappeared from her life, leaving nothing but a trail of questions and broken promises behind. As the day moved on, the ship's excitement increased. Jack and Lucas could hardly sit still. The endless possibilities of the ship, its pool, water slides, and every inch of its deck, held their attention in a tight grip. Emily tried to keep them on a routine, but she was struggling to do so herself. The sudden appearance of Matthew's image in her mind left her distracted. Her thoughts constantly wandering back to that painful period in her life when she had believed so deeply in a future with him. By the time they reached the buffet for lunch, Emily was already drained. She was doing her best to keep it together, smiling and laughing with Jack and Lucas as they eagerly grabbed food from the buffet. But inside, she was a storm of conflicting emotions. And that's when it happened. As she carefully loaded her plate with food, she felt it, her pulse quickened. Her breath shortened. There, across the room, she saw him again, Matthew. But this time, it wasn't a glimpse, it was him. Standing right in front of her. At the edge of the buffet. Talking into his phone. It was as if the world had shifted. And everything around her froze. There he was, looking as confident and polished as ever. Standing in a crowd of strangers who had no idea that he was the man who had once been her world. Her heart lurched, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a deep, undeniable ache. It had been years. How could she still feel this way about him? She took a slow breath, trying to steady her racing heart. He hadn't seen her, hadn't even looked her way. She quickly turned her head, hoping to remain unnoticed. But something in her shifted. Something that felt like a tiny spark of hope, followed closely by a wave of bitterness. He had moved on. He'd left her, and now he was here. In this place, with no explanation, no apology. Matthew had no idea that the mother of his children was standing just feet away from him. Looking at him with eyes filled with both longing and rage. If only he knew. If only he understood. But that was the story of her life now. Wasn't it? The quiet, unspoken grief of a woman who had once believed in love, only to have it disappear without warning. She'd never expected to see him again. And now, as the years of unanswered questions flooded back, she wondered, could she ever forgive him? Would she allow herself to? As the twins finished their meal and begged to explore the pool area, Emily stood frozen for a moment longer. Her eyes locked on Matthew. He had no idea what he had left behind. The next morning, the calm that Emily had found so fleeting the day before shattered completely. It was as if the entire ship had been consumed by a subtle but insistent undercurrent of whispers. She could feel the tension in the air as soon as they walked into the buffet for breakfast. People were talking, their eyes glancing over in her direction, their murmurs growing louder. It was as if they could sense something. But none of them had the courage to outright ask. Jack and Lucas were oblivious to it all. They excitedly pointed at the brightly colored pastries and the buffet spread, asking if they could try everything. Emily smiled, doing her best to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't. She could feel it, the curiosity that prickled her skin. It wasn't just a random curiosity, it was a sharp, invasive feeling, as though the walls around her were closing in. As she sat down at their table, trying to keep their conversation light, she overheard fragments of words from nearby tables. "Isn't that the CEO?" one woman whispered, her voice too loud to be a whisper. "I think those kids look just like him," another voice said. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment was coming, but she hadn't expected it to come so suddenly. It was happening. The rumors, the questions, the scrutiny she had been dreading was beginning to take hold. Emily felt her stomach churn as her mind raced. She knew that people were starting to make the connection. The resemblance between Matthew and the twins wasn't just a passing similarity. It was glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention. And the moment she realized that, a wave of panic rose within her. She could see the reporters now, even though they hadn't yet gathered in force. There was a certain look in the eyes of the passengers around her. It was the kind of look that made her feel exposed, as though they were all waiting for the first person to break the silence and ask the question that no one dared to say aloud. After breakfast, she decided to take the boys up to the pool. She needed to get away from the prying eyes, to give her mind a break. But the moment they arrived at the pool deck, she knew she couldn't escape. Everywhere she looked, there were people staring. The looks had turned into quiet stares, and Emily could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. It was as though everyone was waiting for something. And then, without warning, the first flash went off. A photographer. At first, Emily thought it was just someone taking a photo of the ocean or the scenery. But then the flashes came faster. She felt the heat of their gaze and turned instinctively, clutching Jack's hand a little tighter as they moved away from the poolside. "Mom, who are they?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with confusion as he looked around at the unfamiliar faces snapping photos. Emily's heart raced. They're just taking pictures, sweetie. Nothing to worry about, she said, though her voice trembled. But the truth was, she was deeply worried. This was no longer just about a quiet family vacation, it had become something else entirely. The rumors were already starting to spread, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could shield the boys from it. Back in their cabin, Emily found herself scrolling through her phone, looking for a distraction, but when she checked her messages, she found something she had been dreading. A link from her friend, pointing to an online article. The headline screamed at her, "Mysterious business tycoon and his secret family on a luxury cruise." The image attached to the article was grainy, but it was unmistakable. There, standing with Jack and Lucas at the pool, was Emily, her face caught in a moment of confusion, while the boys stood beside her, clearly resembling Matthew. The caption beneath the photo was enough to send Emily's heart into a panic. Could this be the CEO's secret children? Emily didn't need to read the rest. The damage had already been done. The world had started to piece together the fragments of her past. The secret she had so carefully kept hidden for years was now being exposed for all to see. As the day wore on, the weight of the gossip only grew heavier. Every glance in her direction, every hushed conversation behind her back, felt like another weight added to her shoulders. She tried to keep everything together for Jack and Lucas. But the truth was, she couldn't shield them from what was happening. The world was beginning to know their story. And in that moment, Emily realized that she could no longer protect them from this. The rumors were just the beginning. Soon, there would be questions. And, inevitably, there would be more flashes of cameras. She couldn't stop it anymore. The world was about to learn the truth. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip, casting a golden light across the ship, Emily was exhausted. She had done her best to shield Jack and Lucas from the growing tension around them. But every glance, every whispered word, seemed to take its toll. The peaceful vacation she had envisioned for them now felt more like a fragile mask that could shatter at any moment. She hadn't anticipated that Matthew's sudden presence would pull them into the kind of media frenzy that had followed them here. The waves of anxiety and anger she had felt earlier began to blend with a strange sense of resignation. She had spent years keeping her past with Matthew buried deep within her, trying to create a life where the past didn't hold sway over the present. But now, it was all coming to the surface. And in the midst of the chaos, Matthew was trying to find a way to make amends. Emily had heard his voice on the ship's intercom earlier in the day, announcing a public statement about the rumors surrounding him and the twins. The words were carefully measured, the apology genuine but distant. As much as she wanted to keep her distance, a small part of her couldn't help but listen. She wasn't sure what she expected from him, whether she even wanted anything at all. But hearing him speak, admitting to the possibility that the boys could be his children, left her with more questions than answers. It wasn't long after the statement that Matthew appeared at her cabin. His knock was hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether he was welcome. Emily, still trying to hold onto her composure, opened the door. "Emily," he began, his voice quiet and apologetic. "Can we talk?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped aside to let him in. She didn't want to be rude. But the truth was, she wasn't sure what to say to him. What could she say? All those years of silence had turned her anger into something deep and unyielding. But as he stepped inside, she couldn't help but notice the weary look in his eyes. The same Matthew who had once been full of drive and ambition. Now, he seemed diminished, unsure of himself. "I didn't expect you to be here," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I suppose I should have. You always find a way to show up when I least expect it." Matthew winced at her words, the truth behind them sinking in. "I'm sorry for everything, Emily. I never meant to disappear. I got caught up in everything. I've spent the last few years chasing success. But I've realized it's cost me something more important." Emily crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You think you can just show up now? After all this time?" and expect everything to be fine? You left us. You left me. I had to raise these boys on my own. And now you want to make it all better with a few words? Matthew took a step forward. His eyes earnest. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Emily. I'm asking for a chance. If those boys are mine, I want to be there for them. I want to be in their lives. I made mistakes, but I'm not running away this time. Her chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much he had hurt her, how much his absence had scarred her. But there was something else there, too, something she hadn't expected, a flicker of hope. A part of her that still remembered the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. You can't just step back in and pretend you haven't been gone for all these years, Emily replied, her voice shaking with emotion. You don't get to come in now and act like everything can just be fixed. It doesn't work that way. I know, Matthew said, his voice softer now, but I can't ignore them anymore. I don't want to lose the chance to be their father. I don't know what the future holds. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Emily's heart wavered. She had spent so long keeping her guard up, keeping her heart shielded from the pain of the past. But now, with Matthew standing before her, the walls she had built for years seemed to be crumbling. Was she ready to let him back in? Could she forgive him? And more importantly, could the twins forgive him? Before she could speak again, there was a knock at the door. It was Jack and Lucas, eager as ever, completely unaware of the emotional conversation unfolding inside. Emily's protective instinct kicked in, and she quickly stepped away from Matthew, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for their sake. Everything's fine, sweethearts, Emily said with a forced smile. Why don't you go ahead and play outside for a bit? I'll be right out. Jack and Lucas gave her a puzzled look but nodded, running out to explore the deck. Matthew remained where he was, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. It wasn't until Emily finally spoke that the silence was broken. I'm not sure where to go from here, Matthew, she said quietly, but I'll let you prove to me that you mean what you say. Matthew nodded, his face solemn. I don't expect it to be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. For the first time in years, Emily felt a tiny flicker of hope, fragile, uncertain, but present nonetheless. She didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear. Things were changing. And perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't the only one who had learned a hard lesson about what truly mattered in life. The morning after their conversation, Emily woke to the sound of the ship's gentle hum. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow across the cabin. The twins were already awake, their chatter and laughter filling the room as they excitedly discussed the day's plans. Emily smiled weakly, trying her best to hide the heavy emotions swirling inside her. The weight of the past few days, the resurfacing of memories she had long buried, pressed down on her chest. She knew things couldn't stay as they were. The tension between her and Matthew had only deepened, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. He was here, trying to make amends, and part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that this time, he wouldn't disappear. But she was scared that once she let him in, once she let the twins start to build a relationship with him, he would leave again, and she couldn't risk that. Not now. As the day unfolded, Emily couldn't escape the growing whispers that followed her. The rumors were gaining momentum. And now it wasn't just the passengers on the ship who were talking. A handful of reporters had arrived, their cameras at the ready. They were circling like vultures, waiting for the next moment to strike. Emily tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, the air felt thick with curiosity. And then, out of nowhere, Matthew made the decision. Emily was walking down one of the corridors when she heard the announcement on the intercom. Matthew's voice, clear and firm, filled the ship. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I want to address the rumors surrounding myself and 2 young children on board. While I have not commented publicly before, I feel it is time to set the record straight. The words hung in the air, and Emily froze in her tracks. Her heart pounded as she listened, her body tense with anxiety. Was he about to confirm it? Was he going to claim the boys were his? She didn't know how to feel about that. But the truth was, she had been waiting for him to say something. She just never expected it to come in such a public way. Matthew continued, his voice steady, though Emily could hear the faint tremor in it. There is a strong possibility that these children are mine. I've only recently learned of their existence. And I want to make it clear that I take full responsibility for my past mistakes. I ask for privacy and respect for the mother and children. None of them deserve the scrutiny or speculation that has been forced upon them. As Emily listened, her emotions swirled, shock, anger, disbelief. She didn't know whether she should be angry with him for making such an announcement, or relieved that he was finally stepping up. For years, she had raised the boys on her own. And now the truth was out there for everyone to see. No more secrets. No more pretending. When Matthew's announcement ended, the silence felt deafening. She wasn't sure how to process it. She didn't even know what to do next. Minutes later, she found herself standing in front of the small cafe on the deck. The morning's light was warm, but it did little to ease the unease building within her. She felt exposed, as though the walls around her had crumbled, leaving her vulnerable. And yet, despite the media frenzy and the whispers that had followed them, part of her couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. As the twins ran past her, excited to explore more of the ship, Emily's mind lingered on Matthew's words. He wasn't running away anymore. But could she really trust him again? Could she let him into their lives after all the pain he had caused? She didn't have the answers. But she knew one thing. She couldn't face this alone anymore. Later that evening, as the ship's lights twinkled in the distance, Emily found herself standing on the top deck, gazing out over the water. She was no longer running from the past. But neither was she ready to embrace it fully. For the first time in years, she wondered if there was a chance, just a small one, that she could open her heart again. And allow the man who had once broken it to help heal the family they had both created. Even if only slowly. In the distance, she saw Matthew standing by the railing, his back turned to her. A quiet sense of uncertainty hung between them. But also something new, something fragile, yet possibly strong enough to build a future. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy. But as she stood there watching him, Emily realized that maybe, just maybe, they could try again. As the days on the cruise sailed by, Emily felt herself slowly coming to terms with the complexity of the situation. She and Matthew had shared tentative conversations, each one more revealing than the last. The weight of the past was still heavy on her shoulders. But with every small step, she saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility that they could build something new. Something stronger. Together, Matthew spent time with the twins, slowly earning their trust, even as Emily stood back, observing. The boys, with their bright smiles and innocent laughter, seemed to open a door that Emily thought had been shut for good. She watched as Matthew genuinely tried, not just to mend his relationship with her, but to prove to the boys that he could be there for them, something he had never done before. But the real breakthrough came when Emily found herself smiling, genuinely smiling, as Matthew played games with the boys, showing them the kind of love and care she had longed for them to have. She realized that perhaps, just perhaps, their family could be whole again, even if it meant navigating the difficult path ahead. The rumors had died down, and the ship was no longer filled with whispers. The family they had once been, and could be again, was slowly finding its way back. Emily had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and that sometimes, second chances were the only way to heal. As the cruise neared its end, Emily found herself more at peace with the future. She didn't know what it would look like, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope. The journey they had begun was just the start of something new. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible life stories. Stay tuned for the next one.